Yo, yo, it's time to discover the flow. Shout out to the bros. You know, I like to welcome everybody to discover the flow. No matter how you discover the show or discover the bros, now you about to see how far we can go, because it's time for discover the flow. Yeah, cowabunga do. You know live is how we come to you. Turn the levels up when you hear the boys coming through. The Pod Squad giving you just what you need, hitting you with a new special guest every week. Don't you dare hit skip, man, it's Tristan and Kip. DTF Pod about to take you on a trip. Mega Ran bring the heat, yeah. But be clear, I wasn't even supposed to be here. Welcome to Discover the Flow. No matter how you discovered the show or discovered the bros, now you about to see how far we can go, because it's time for Discover the Flow. Let's start the show.
Yeah, well, mine, I need to do a little bit of work here. This whole thing is...
It's 10:30 at night here, so my moustache starts to droop when it gets.
Mine gets tired too. It's okay. Totally understand.
It's almost like the hands on the clock for him. So
yeah.
Just to give you a heads up on two things. One, when we're done, stick around for like an extra minute or two, because it's a local recording.
Yeah,
and then it has to upload for us.
Yeah, it should get you out of there right after like a minute or so. And then there's a possibility of us losing connection. Hopefully not, but we're under tornado warnings right now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we got some severe weather rolling through. It doesn't seem to be too bad right now, so hopefully it won't be.
Yeah.
Whereas London, we have mild drizzle. Yeah.
Yeah, but you have that all year round, don't you?
Yeah, we do. Yeah, basically, yeah.
It's like Seattle there. So.
Yes, basically Portland or something like that. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad we're finally able to talk to you. You know, we had some issues with our previous engagement that we had, but so you traveled to where did you travel to?
I was in Rio de Janeiro last week. I was at the Rio Carnival, and before that, I was in Istanbul. I've been traveling all over the place, but Sorry, I was in Istanbul. Filming a documentary on the Shroud of Jesus, which before it was in Turin a long time ago was in Constantinople. So before it got stolen from there. So allegedly by the Templars, they say, but no evidence for that. But I went there to do it. It was Austrian TV of all things.
Wow.
So very interesting.
Yeah, I've followed you for a long time.
Before we really get cooking, why don't you tell everybody who you are?
Okay.
And what you're here to talk about today?
Yeah. Well, my name's Tony McMahon. I do pop up on the History Channel. For some reason, I score with American audiences. I don't know why, but long may it last. And I'm here today. I guess I'm here today. I've got the two books here, the two offending books. This came out last month, a book on the Knights Templar. It's actually the first of a trilogy. The second one, Downfall of the Templars, later this year, and then one on the Knights Templar and Freemasonry, be the third one. But Pen and Sword published that. It's the Knights Templar History and Mystery. So that kind of gives you the kind of the mainstream history, you know, where they came from, where they went, and their downfall. And
we're going to get all three of those before George R.R. Martin finishes the last Game of Thrones book, right?
Well, I'm hoping I'm a bit faster than him.
Pretty sure his snail is faster than him.
Well, not as rich, though, but not yet. Anyway, but the other one that I wrote last year, I hope you can see that's paperback. So it's Jack the Ripper and Abraham Lincoln, based on I first got interested in that actually from an episode of William Shatner's The Unexplained that I did for history. And it's just that they said to me, can you talk about this Irish-American guy who got arrested as a Jack the Ripper suspect? And in my research, I found out that not only was he arrested in 1888 over the Jack the Ripper case, he was arrested in 1865, 25 years before, in the Abraham Lincoln assassination, in association with that. I thought, how random is it? What, Jack the Ripper was involved in assassinating Abraham Lincoln? I've got to look into this a bit more. So that's where that book came from.
And we would definitely like to hit on both of those topics because they both, honestly, I didn't know anything about the Jack the Ripper Abraham Lincoln connection, but once I started looking into it, it's absolutely fascinating. But my personal topic of choice tonight is going to be the Knights Templar. I've been a fan of that time period and the Knights Templar and their mythology for a long time.
Yeah. Well, I think honest to God, I think people never lose their interest in the Knights Templar. I think half the stuff I do quite a bit of telly, and half the stuff I do, I think is in some way Templar related. I think, and especially I've got to say, Americans, over there in the United States, you love the Templars, but the question is, what kind of Templars? Because of course, the Knights Templar are different things to different people.
And I believe. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I know the Templar were originally supposedly French noblemen that were tasked with protecting the Pilgrims, but was that a front?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? I mean, so you get a kind of an origin story that sometimes reads a bit like Robin Hood and his merry men. You get 9 knights, from France, from the Champagne region, and they're very troubled about pilgrims getting attacked on the roads into Jerusalem. This is when the Crusaders, if you do your history right, the Crusaders, they've gone into the Middle East, they've retaken Jerusalem from the Muslims in 1099. Then fast forward 20 years, and there's lots of problems. Basically, the Crusaders are struggling to keep a hold on Jerusalem, and a lot of Christian pilgrims who thought, yeah, we can go to Jerusalem again, it's now under Crusader control, find that they're murdered, robbed, whatever, on the roads into Jerusalem by a population that aren't very happy at being ruled by Crusaders. So the Templars are kind of set up as to protect these pilgrims, but there's a bit more to it than that going on. I mean, there is a problem with actually getting knights to stay in the Holy Land, because most knights go, oh, it's that time of year, I better go home and do the harvest, and I'm missing my wife, this kind of thing. And the Templars are kind of a standing army who stay there all the time. But more importantly, they've got a kind of an ethos, and a uniform. And this is all quite new, the logo, the red cross that we all know. This is all new because knights normally turned up on the battlefield dressed however they wanted to be dressed, their family crest or whatever, and they charged in an ill-disciplined manner. But the Templars they're living by this life of really strict prayer and this strict rule book, and they don't marry, and it's poverty, chastity, and obedience, and all that kind of thing. And then I guess what you're hinting at is, on top of that, people then ask, well, why did they specifically want to be based in the temple in Jerusalem, or what they thought had once been Solomon's temple? Were they digging underneath? Were they looking for stuff? Did they have an ulterior motive? And of course, that even when they were around, by the way, people were asking that question. This isn't something new. The conspiracy theories against the Templar go right back to the beginning, to when they were around, and it's why they got crushed in the end, because they were overwhelmed by the kind of mountain of stuff that was being said about them. I'm not going to say lies, because it was stuff that was being said about that may or may not have been lies.
So you mentioned the Temple of Solomon, or what they thought was the Temple of Solomon.
Yeah.
What is the speculation on that as to whether were they actually in the right place, or were they in the wrong place? What was?
I think they're in the right. I mean, so today, if you look at the Temple Mount, what they call the Temple Mount, I think some people, most people, I think, don't quite know what's being talked about there. So basically, go back in your Bible, King Solomon builds the temple to house the Ark of the Covenant, which contains the 10 Commandments, and it's kept there, and it's very holy. Then it gets ransacked by the Babylonians in the 500s BC. The Ark of the Covenant disappears, never to be seen again, or so we think. And then basically a second temple gets built by King Herod, that King Herod, who murders the innocents and doesn't particularly like Jesus. And then about 70, 80 years after that, the Jewish people revolt, and the Romans burn that temple down. They destroy that temple, never to be built again. But the foundations of that temple, which was absolutely huge, that platform on top of a hill, stone platform, that is what was once the foundations of an enormous temple. And then later, the Muslim rulers of Jerusalem, who came, hundreds of years later, built the Dome of the Rock on top and what's called the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Now, it's the Al-Aqsa Mosque. If you look at that building today, that's the building that the Templars took over. And they believed that they believe the whole area was the Temple of Solomon, but they specifically believe that that was at the heart of Solomon's temple, and that the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant was kept, was under there somewhere. And actually, a lot of the building that we call the Al-Aqsa Mosque that you see today was built by the Templars. It's just been reversioned now as a mosque. But they did sincerely believe that they were sitting on top of King Solomon's temple, where, you know, God lived, where the Ark of the Covenant had been, you know. So it's pretty, and that's why they're called the Templars, by the way. It's a big longer name, but I won't give you the whole long name, but it's the Templars. Yeah.
What do you think about the possibility that the Ark is either under Roslyn Chapel or St. Mary of Zion Cathedral in Ethiopia?
I was up in Roslyn Chapel last year. I'll tell you something. I was there in early August, and I went there years ago. Now, last year I went there, it was packed. You know, people love all these stories about Roslyn. People are coming from all over the world these days. There's no sign of people losing interest. Obviously, the Da Vinci Code movie made it famous throughout the world. You know, with the final scene with Tom Hanks there in Roslyn Chapel. So I talk in this book, and actually in my second book, about links between the Sinclair family, who were the kind of local lords, and Roslyn Chapel, and whether now the Templars actually had been crushed by the time Roslyn Chapel was built, the Roslyn Chapel that you see today. But the theory is that they continued in some way, shape, or form, eventually becoming the Freemasons, basically, but that they hid their treasure there in Roslyn. Now, the reason people think that is because when the Templars were crushed, the King of Scotland, Robert the Bruce, had actually been excommunicated by the Pope. He'd been kicked out of the church. So the theory goes that when the Templars were arrested, when they had these arrest warrants that the King of France sent out to arrest all the Templars in France, the Templars got wind of this, got their treasure together, went down to a port called La Rochelle on the west coast of France, and then fled up to Scotland, where they believed that this king, Robert the Bruce, had been kicked out of the church, would give them, you know, safe passage. They'd be able to hide out, and that they ended up staying there, and they buried their treasure. And some people think the Holy Grail is under Roslyn. Some people think the Ark of the Covenant is there. So I think some people think John the Baptist's head is under there. But when you go, by the way, which you should go, it's a really interesting, it's a bit spooky. It's a very interesting place. It's quite unique, Roslyn Chapel. Very strange decorations there. I don't know if you've actually been there. Have you been able to go there?
No, we've not been that lucky.
You gotta go. I mean, the other theory is that they went down to Portugal, where the Portuguese protected them, because the Portuguese liked them, because the Templars had helped the Portuguese fight the Muslims in what's now Spain and Portugal. Because remember, there wasn't just a crusade in the Holy Land, there was also a crusade in Spain and Portugal, which was successful, the one in Spain and Portugal, because they pushed the Muslims all the way down, and eventually Spain and Portugal became two Christian kingdoms. Not so successful in the Holy Land, of course, where they got defeated and kicked out. But yeah, but there's a big question mark about, you know, did they have the Holy Grail? Did they find the Ark of the Covenant? Did they find the Passion relics of Jesus? And if they did, where did they hide them? Where did they put them?
And Tristan had mentioned this already, but is there any tangible thought or tangible proof that it could be in Ethiopia? Because the Ethiopian church is very believes 100% that they have, or at least their story is that they have that ark.
Yeah, sorry, I wasn't. I forgot about Ethiopia. Pretty last question. The Ethiopian. I mean, you got first thing is the Ethiopian Christian Church is incredibly ancient. I mean, it's older than many Christian churches in Europe. You know, the Ethiopians were converted very early on. It's something that's often forgotten. And yeah, they did claim that they do claim that they have the Ark of the Covenant in the Church of Zion. They don't let anybody go and look at it. It's obviously kept under wraps. Is it the Ark of the Covenant? Well, I mean, there was trade, there was movement between ancient Judea and Ethiopia. Ethiopia was connected to ancient Egypt and all that part of the world. They think that Yemen across the water was actually Sheba. So there are the connections there to Solomon and so on. So it's, if the Ark of the Covenant was going to be anywhere, it's not beyond the realms of, imagination that it could be in Ethiopia. In fact, I would say it's more likely to be in Ethiopia than Scotland. That's quite a journey.
Well, it's a lot closer.
Yeah. Would you say something like the Ark would be more coveted back then or now?
Oh, I mean, obviously, do you know what? I wonder how many of us knew about the Ark of the Covenant before Indiana Jones.
I'm going to just be honest, as an ignorant American, I didn't.
I mean,
honestly,
I'm pretty sure I saw the movie multiple times before I even knew what the hell it was. You know what I mean?
What do you know? I think if you said to most people, "What is in the Ark of the Covenant?" It's most people say, "Well, actually, I don't know," but it is. The whole point about the Ark of the Covenant, as you know, was to house the Ten Commandments, also some of the manna that fell from heaven and the rod of Aaron and so on. And the point about the Ark of the Covenant was that this was almost supposed to be like a weapon of mass destruction. That the Jews led this, they went into battle carrying this thing like a nuclear missile, and of course they walked around the walls of Jericho, and the walls of Jericho fell down. And if you touched it, even there's a story of it being carried and somebody steadies it as it's about to fall over, and they die because how God punishes you for even daring to touch it, even if you're touching it for a good reason. And then, of course, if you look into it, well, that's it. Your curtains, you're over. I think it's a fascinating relic. It's fascinating because it's so evil in some ways. I mean, it's such a destructive thing. It's such a horrible thing. It inflicts plagues on people. It inflicted boils on the Philistines when they stole it briefly. But I think we are fascinated by it today, maybe because we're so worried about weapons of mass destruction and nuclear weapons these days that the Ark of the Covenant makes us think, oh,
it is a relic of an angrier God, a less forgiving, less loving God. Yeah. So that makes a certain amount of sense. The Old Testament God, as anybody that went to church probably knows. I grew up in the Methodist Church, so I kind of at least have a little bit of theology in my background. But yeah, the Old Testament God was an angry, violent God. The New Testament God is a very loving and caring God.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because one of the things about the Knights Templar, and it was something I was reading about the other day, is their critics at the time said, hang on a moment, you're a bunch of knights fighting for God, fighting for Jesus. Where does it say that in the New Testament? And they said, and there was actually a Cistercian monk who said this. He said, no, you're a devilish creation. You're not a Christian creation at all. And other people said, you've actually been influenced by the Muslims, because you're like the Christian equivalent of jihadis. You've got that you're not actually anything to do with Christianity at all. And a lot of this was raked up during their trials, that they were not, where did Jesus ever say, oh, by the way, get a shield and a sword and build some castles and kill in my name? There's plenty of that in the Old Testament. And plenty in the Quran, but there's not much of that in the New Testament. So it was one of the criticisms of the Templars, because they were this new kind of army, and a lot of people at the time thought, well, we don't really like this. This isn't what I read in the New Testament. So it was used against them at the end to destroy them.
But at the same time, nobility took everything at the point of a sword and claimed it was God's will. So it's kind of an interesting juxtaposition there.
Well, that's why Pope Urban, who started the Crusades, he started the Crusades in a Europe that was very violent, and anarchic, and sometimes it was one king after another, all murdering each other, and I think what the popes wanted to do, apart from the fact they wanted to exert more control over Europe, and the Crusades kind of allowed them to do that, they also wanted to bring a kind of purpose into all this violence. They knew they couldn't stop the violence, but they wanted to kind of channel it into something, positive. And essentially what they did is they channeled it in the direction of Jerusalem and said, why don't we go and retake that? Why don't you go and do something, useful with all this violence of yours? And, what the popes used to say to the nobles, they used to say, now, listen, if you go on crusade in Jerusalem or in Spain and Portugal, you'll get this number of years off your purgatory. When you die and you're in the waiting room waiting to get into paradise, I'll take some time off the waiting, as it were. That's basically, putting it crudely, that's what the Pope said, and that was a convincing argument. Aside from the fact they also hoped they'd get rich as well once they got there, but that actually very rarely happened.
So, did I hear you correctly earlier when you said that originally the Ark was in the hands of the Jewish people?
The Ark of the Covenant.
All right, Steve, I think we just figured out why that thing kills Jews. Or not, I'm sorry, kills Nazis.
Okay,
oh, yes,
it was a movie. Get over it.
But it was such a good movie.
No, it was very definitely in the hands of the Jewish people. It's what they took when they Joshua went to the siege of Jericho. That's when Moses had the 10 Commandments, but he wasn't allowed to enter the Promised Land. And then they take the 10 Commandments, and God actually tells them the exact specifications for the Ark of the Covenant. The measurements, what it's going to be made of, blah blah blah, and then they put it in, and then of course God channels this kind of evil energy into it that basically they can fire at their enemies. It's very, very much a part of the Israelite Jewish story.
So I have a very specific question about all this. What is the Temple Church of London, if you can explain that?
Yeah, so basically the Templars, and it actually relates to how they got very rich very quickly, because that's one of the other things that people didn't like at the time, and they're still asking questions today. And this is why people think the Templars had, sacred artifacts or had found, enormous wealth. The Templars got very rich very quick. Now, the way we know they did it officially is that they had this network of commanderies, network of kind of estates across Europe, which did things like dairy farming, sheep farming, all kind of agricultural stuff, small manufacture and so on. And it was to generate money that they can then channel to the Holy Land to pay for the Crusades. And the whole of Europe was divided up into kind of provinces. So England was one of the Templar provinces. And you had the Grand Master in Jerusalem running the whole show, but then you had these provincial Grand Masters. And the English Grand Master basically lived in London, in the Temple in London. And there was a temple in Paris, which was huge. Actually, the one in Paris was massive. And they were these buildings with big, thick walls. And the reason they had big, thick walls is because not only were they running all this agricultural stuff, they also used to run like banks. They operated like banks. And they would say to people, oh, you're off to the Holy Land. You can deposit your money here in London, in our temple here in London. We'll give you a little chitty with a secret code on it. When you arrive in Jerusalem, it's like cashing a check. No, this has never been done before. So these knights could go out, and instead of carrying all their money with them and getting robbed, they just had to carry a little piece of paper. And they say, oh, this I banked with the temple in London, so now give me, whatever, how many francs or whatever, pounds or whatever, when they arrived in Jerusalem. So that's the temple is still there, or part of it is still there in London, the church. And the churches were built like octagonal, and they were built to resemble the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. They were built very specifically to look like that. The one in London, as I say, it's still there. You can still see these Crusaders there, their graves. It did get hit in the Second World War by the Germans. They did put a bomb into it, and it blew the roof off. But otherwise, the walls and everything are all, and you'll have seen it, of course, in the Da Vinci Code. I shouldn't name check that film again, but you've seen it in that movie as well. But yeah, pops up in there.
So was that like the first, almost world bank, if you will? The Templars were the first world bank and the first system for banking.
That's what people. I mean, I think there's a good argument for saying they were. It was certainly a unique proposition. So they, as I say, they kind of held on to your deposits. They, people just wanted to put their jewelry in there for safekeeping. They also lent money as well, which is unusual because it was actually illegal for Christians to lend money. That's why Jews were the only people allowed to lend money. But the Templars also got into banking. They kind of bent the rules a bit to get into that, and they got so good at accounting that they actually ended up running the state finances on occasion in France and England. When the king said, "Oh, I don't understand my own accounts. Oi, Templars, come and run my account." And so that's basically, they were very good at running money. You kind of think of the Templars always as warriors and so on, but they were very good bankers. Which didn't make them popular always, of course, because people don't like bankers. Another reason it was probably easy to crush them at the end, because lots of people owed them money.
It's real easy to garner that that group mindset of going after them if everybody owes you.
But they were like bankers with swords.
It's a terrifying thought.
Yes.
But they were also able to hide it all, so it's like they were the first ones to come up with their offshore accounts.
Yeah, I mean, and this is the thing, is that when the Templars are, eventually what happens is King Philip of France, he's short of money anyway. He's fighting England. He's a bit short of cash. He's already gone after the Jews. He's gone after the Catholic Church. He's gone after Italian merchants, and then he thinks, oh, the Templars, they're sitting on a lot of money in Paris. If I shut them down, I can get my hands on their money. But he has a lot of trouble actually finding where that money is. I mean, there is a story that he turned up at the Paris Temple and there was nothing there. Basically, the cupboard was bare. Some people don't. Some people think there was a lot of money there, but it took them years to really go through the Templar accounts and try and find where all the stuff was. And clearly they didn't find where all of it was. And a lot of stuff went walkies, never to be seen again, including those sacred treasures, if they had them, the Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant, etc.
There's a couple of rumors I want to touch on, just because I want to see what you think about them. The first one being that the Templar were rumored to have engaged in both satanic and sexual practices.
So I do touch on that in the book, but I've got a second book out this year called Downfall of the Templars, and I am putting forward my theory that there may have been no smoke without fire. There may have been some truth in this. So just to say, the Templars at the end, the arrest warrants that were sent out in France, because they were basically arrested in France first by the King of France, and the Pope kind of agreed to this, accused them of two things. One was heresy, which was basically spreading incorrect religious beliefs, but more specifically, even worshipping a demon called Baphomet, which is what they said they did. They also worshipped some kind of head, which may have been the head of this demon. Some people thought it was the head of the first Grand Master. Some people thought it was the head of John the Baptist, but there was some kind of weird pagan heretical thing going on. And I remember heresy at this time was punishable by being burned at the stake. So you were tied to a stake and burned. So there's no life. And of course, this is what actually ended up happening to the last Templar Grand Master. So very serious crime, because the church was in control of society, and the Catholic Church. And, heresy was an attack on the church, an attack on the Pope. So you were going to get it, basically. But the other thing was sodomy, was the other thing that they were accused of. And it was said in their trials over and over again that they exchanged inappropriate kisses, specifically on the base of the spine, which I think you can guess it's on the bottom, basically, the backside. But sodomy was increasingly used at this time as a way to bring people down, political enemies down. But it's interesting with the Templars, it's kind of the two things that combine together. Heresy and sodomy. So the idea that these knights, who everybody had thought for 200 years were the warriors for Christ, that they were the poster boys of the Crusades, were now being accused of engaging in diabolic rituals behind closed doors, of having orgies, all male orgies, basically, initiating the young knights in inappropriate ways. And all of this was raised, and all sorts of things, including worshipping cats and so on. And I actually argue in the next book, I think this was the first of the witch trials, because what was about to happen in Europe was there was going to be the explosion of witch hunting and witch trials, where, you know, people got obsessed with this idea of dark magic everywhere. And you can kind of see some of the themes coming through with the Templar trials, you know, and and there are other trials going on at the same time, by the way, as the Templars. There's a group of women called the Beguines, female preachers, who are also being burned at the time. There's a bishop who the same king, King Philip, who's going after Templars, he accuses this bishop of murdering his wife using magic, using potions and spells. So there's a lot of kind of this magic and witchcraft thing that's building up. And the Templars really get caught up in this, and they get accused of some pretty interesting stuff.
Before I hit on the other rumor, you kind of made me think about something in there. Is there the possibility that they really started out with the best of intentions and then just, I mean, as we've all seen, power and money corrupts all?
Yeah. I think that was very much, that's kind of one of the tacks that they took at the time, the prosecution took at the time, was that, you know, people had joined the Templars in good faith, but this order had basically sunk into satanic practices, that it had become very rich very quickly, so it had become corrupt. It enjoyed, by the way, a whole load of privileges that the popes initially gave them. So they were immune effectively from prosecution. They were only accountable to the Pope in Rome, so they didn't have to answer for anything to a local lord or king or, you know, a local bishop. They only had to answer the Pope. And this immunity began to make people think, you know what, they've got completely out of control. They're a law unto themselves. And you've got to think about it from the King of France's point of view. You've got an armed body of men who are very rich, who've got these castles, basically, all over France. And I, the king, don't control them. I've got no control over these people. I don't know what they're doing, what they're thinking, what's going on in their meetings, what are their rituals, and so on. So, yeah, that all builds up to a head in 1307, Friday the 13th, 1307, when they serve these arrest warrants. The king's had enough, you know. And yeah, I think there was a lot of people who thought that the Templars had gone completely rotten and needed to be dealt with, needed to be shut down.
It's wild because it almost sounds like your first example of like a cult or organized crime. You know what I mean?
That's certainly how. And you know, they were accused of collaborating with the enemy. They were accused of, you know, working too closely with the Saracens, of the Muslim Saracens. They were accusing of operating their own agenda. And by the way, you mentioned the London Temple earlier, and you talk about organized crime. There was, they invited the Grand Master of Ireland to come to London, and he was kind of subordinate to the Temple in London. So they asked the Grand Master of London to come to a meeting at the Temple in London. So he came, and then they just locked him in a cell, and it was a cell so small that he could only stand up. And they basically accused him of having stolen money from his own order, from the Templars, and they left him there, and he starved to death, basically. And they did that intentionally. And there were 2 Templars who confessed to this during the trial. So there's a dark side to the Templars, you know, what they were doing behind closed doors. And of course, there was no accountability. There's no regulators, you know, going in to have a look at them or anything like that. Even the king couldn't look at them. So yeah, there's you can see why things went very badly wrong for the Templars. It took 200 years though for things to go badly wrong, but they did eventually.
So the other rumor that Tristan was mentioning, during research, we kind of saw this. Is there any kind of proof or anything that they may have found evidence that Jesus Christ wasn't crucified, and then they kind of hid it away?
So there's always been a long running view that the Templars kind of imbibed other religious beliefs in the Holy Land, and that they discovered truths. They discovered versions of Christianity that have been forgotten or suppressed in the West. I mean, for example, Gnosticism. That's one thing that's often said, that this version of Christianity where it's doubted that Christ ever became truly human or that he was even crucified. So yeah, I mean, and this is one of the fears that people had about the Templars, that they'd gone native in the Holy Land, that they'd been spending too much time with either Muslims, or and there still are today in the Middle East, different forms of Christianity that once existed, more widely, but now only exist in the Middle East, and of course you've got to remember that's where Christianity started. So there's even a version of Christianity in the Middle East that recognizes, that only believes John the Baptist was the Messiah and that Jesus was an imposter, the Mandeans. So what people thought was that the Templars had either kind of picked up ideas from other people in the Middle East, or maybe, as you say, that they had found evidence, they'd found texts, or they'd even found physical evidence that really undermined their faith, their belief in the Roman Catholic faith, and that's why they kind of, as it were, turned against the church and became what they became, and maybe that accounts for their diabolic rituals and so on.
The other thing you mentioned, and this is just kind of curiosity, you talked about going on a trip and looking for the Shroud of Turin, in your travels recently. Did the Templars potentially have the Shroud of Turin?
So it's a really interesting story. So I was in Istanbul, what's now Istanbul, but used to be Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire, and you can still see these amazing. I mean, obviously the Hagia Sophia, which was built in the 500s, and it's still there. It's now a mosque, but it was a church for 1,000 years. And basically, the story, I'll keep it very quickly. The story is that, and this comes from Roman historians and early Christians and so on, is that there was an Arab king of Edessa at the time that Jesus was still alive. He had leprosy. He wrote to Jesus and said, "I've got leprosy, cure me." And Jesus said, "I'll send one of my disciples to help you out." And this disciple turned up basically either with the face cloth that was put on Jesus' face, the veil of Veronica, or with the complete shroud. Now, people disagree about whether it was the face cloth or the entire shroud. So we were going on the assumption that it was the entire shroud. And we know that at some point that then ended up in Constantinople in the 900s AD. We know that happened because it was written about at the time, and it was celebrated, paraded around the city. They were very proud to have this put in a chapel. But then, unfortunately, 300 years later, the year 1204, a bunch of crusaders turned up in Constantinople. Now, Constantinople was a Christian city, but it wasn't Catholic. It was Orthodox. So it wasn't in communion with the Pope. But it always got on with the crusaders, a bit uneasy, but it always got on. But these crusaders decided to loot Constantinople. But that city, by the way, had never fallen in 800 years. But they managed to breach the walls, got into the city, and burnt down about a third of the city and looted the emperor's holy relics. And the shroud and other relics were taken, some of them to Venice. The 4 bronze horses that you see in Venice today on top of St. Mark's, they came from that looting from Constantinople. But the story is that the shroud then ends up in France with a family called the Descharnay family. Now, there are 2 Templars burned in the year 1314 at the end of the Templar trials, which lasted 7 years. One is Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master, and the other guy is called Geoffrey Descharnay. And one of his ancestors then displays the shroud for the first time. And it's that shroud that ends up in Turin as the Turin shroud today. So what we were trying to prove in Istanbul was that we could trace that shroud from Turin through the Dukes of Savoy, through the Descharnay family and the Templars, back to Constantinople, back to Edessa, back to Jesus. So that's what we were trying to show. And I think if there's any holy relic that the Templars might have truly had, actually, weirdly, I think the shroud is probably the one where you can say that there is at least some written evidence that, you know, there are some dots. Whether you can join them completely is the question. And I think that, so it was a very interesting to go there. And by the way, if you've never been to Istanbul, which was Constantinople, please go. Put it on your bucket list, because it's such an amazing, amazing place, and so much history above ground and below ground. There's a lot of it is below ground. You know, amazing stuff.
Yeah, there's a lot of traveling I would like to do internationally that I just right now cannot afford. That's a lot of money to travel on.
I like asking this question of every topic that we hit on with somebody. So before we move on to Jack the Ripper,
yeah,
what's your favorite thing that you've ever learned about the Knights Templar? Something that might be like, oh, I got to tell you this one thing, you know?
I think actually the discovery that the King of France was actually putting other people on trial, basically for witchcraft, for sorcery, at the same time as the Templars, which to me suggests that the King of France, it wasn't just about the money. I think he genuinely believed that the Templars were guilty of heresy, of what he was accusing them of, that they were guilty of demonic black magic, that they were sorcerers. I think he was a very religious man. He genuinely believed his wife had been killed by magic, and I think he very likely did believe a lot of the stuff that was said about the Templars. So I explore that in the next book a lot more. Don't want to give away too much, but I do think that in some ways is what excited me the most, is the realization it wasn't just about the money. It's not that simple. You know, we're talking about medieval people here. They're a bit weird, you know. They really did believe in devils and witches and, you know, wizards, and they burned people for it, you know. And they burned the Templars. You know, they burned 54 Templars in one go.
I mean, if people did that today, I wouldn't be even super surprised, to be honest.
Well, it might be heading that way, but yeah.
So since you're so gracious to stay up with this late right now, maybe honestly we could talk about the Knights Templar and stuff for probably a good 2 hours, but let's shift over to Jack the Ripper. Now, what is your initial theory about Jack the Ripper and the connection with Abraham Lincoln?
So I was asked to do a TV program. It's a program I've done a few episodes for, actually. William Shatner's The Unexplained. Good old William Shatner of Star Trek fame. And I was asked to look at a guy called Francis Tumblety, who was an Irish American who was arrested in London over the Jack the Ripper case. And Francis Tumblety was a kind of larger-than-life character. He was well known already in America as a quack doctor, very high profile. He called himself the Indian herb doctor. He used to buy acres of classified ads in the newspapers. He kind of used the emerging mass newspaper press to make himself famous. I mean, he really was a kind of celebrity. Comes to London, nobody really knows him in England, and he's arrested as a suspect in the Jack the Ripper case. Now, I kind of thought, okay, well, that's interesting. But then when I started to research it, I looked back at 19th century newspapers, and I discovered that he'd been arrested in 1865, that's 25 years before the Jack the Ripper case, as a suspect in the Abraham Lincoln assassination. And the reason for that was that he employed in his pharmacy a guy called David Herold, who was one of the Lincoln conspirators. And he also knew John Wilkes Booth, and that I managed to uncover from a newspaper in 1914, an interview with a retired police captain who was looking back at the Civil War period. And he said, oh, yeah, I remember that Francis Tumblety. He used to hang out with John Wilkes Booth here in Buffalo. Oh, wow, okay. So he knew John Wilkes Booth, and he introduced Booth to Mary Surratt. And Mary Surratt is the woman who was hanged, you know, the 4 people who were hanged at once. So he knew Surratt, he knew David Herold, he knew John Wilkes Booth. No wonder Ed Stanton, you know, the Minister of War under Lincoln, you know, said, I want this man arrested. And he was put in the old Capitol prison and interrogated, let out after a few months. Absolutely furious, of course. Tumblety was great at bluster. But then the more I investigated Tumblety, I found he'd been done for 2 manslaughters previously, and also a string of obscenity cases, because Tumblety was basically gay. There's no doubt he was into young men, and he employed these young men. David Herold was probably one of them, and he's always been done for obscenities by the Pinkertons, by the police, and both here in the UK, where I am now, and in the United States. So he's a very colourful character. He also, by the way, he looks completely crazy, because he used to publicize his medical business in the United States by wearing a plumed helmet and a kind of cavalry uniform, and he used to ride down Main Street on a kind of circus horse with one of his assistants, including David Herold, dressed as a kind of Native American boy, handing out pamphlets, and these 2 greyhounds. I mean, he was a real sight. So he was kind of like a bit of a P.T. Barnum, in terms of his publicity. But yeah, I mean, the more I read, the more I thought, oh my God, this guy there's so much to him. But that connection to the 2 greatest crimes of the 19th century, I just thought, this is bonkers. How on earth does one man get involved in those 2 crimes? But there you are, he did.
You triggered 2 questions for me, and I was already thinking about one of them. What was the possibility that there was a erotic relationship between Tumblety and Wilkes Booth? And then the other question is, like, the murders, the 5 murders were what, like during the span of a couple of months? And didn't he supposedly leave after the first 2 and then come back? So, like, I mean, I don't know about the travel 140 years ago. Like, could he have conceivably done that time frame?
So basically, he, in terms of Wilkes Booth, who obviously is dead, in 1865. So he knows Wilkes Booth. Obviously, Wilkes Booth's kind of voracious sexuality has been, discussed by a lot of people, and we believe it's mainly women, but there's been a suggestion that he may have been bisexual. Tumblety, there's absolutely no doubt it's men. I mean, he talks about his hatred of women. And by the way, this is one of the reasons he was also a suspect in the Ripper case, is he had a long record of talking in really disparaging, misogynistic terms about women. He also, by the way, had a collection of women's uteruses in glass jars that he used to show at his dinner parties.
Jesus.
That was actually talked about by a Union soldier who went to one of his dinner parties, a guy called Captain Dunham. When Scotland Yard heard about that from their American police counterparts, by telegram, they went, oh God, well, 2 of the victims, of the Ripper's victims, had their uteruses missing. This guy is harvesting uteruses. He is clearly has medical knowledge, and of course the way that these women were eviscerated, the Ripper's victims were eviscerated in 1888. Immediately, Scotland Yard thought, okay, this has got to be this guy. In terms of the kind of time frame, he's in London for what's called the 5 canonical murders, the 5 women murdered by Jack the Ripper. But at the time, that wasn't obvious, because there were a couple of women murdered before, and there were women who were murdered after. And when Tumblety skipped bail, which he did, he skipped bail and ran off to France and then back to New York. The London Metropolitan Police, there was another murder afterwards, and the Metropolitan Police thought, oh, it's obviously not him. Well, that murder is now not regarded as one of Jack the Ripper's murders. And actually, when he got back to New York, there was a woman murdered in New York called Carrie Brown, who was eviscerated in a hotel. And a lot of journalists began to say, oh, it must be Tumblety. Also, by the way, when he got back to New York, when he ran away from the police in 1888, got back to New York, he turns up with a very strange guy who was called Jack the Texan, who is this very mysterious valet that he was hanging out with, younger guy. And even at the time, journalists said, could this guy have helped Francis Tumblety commit the murders in London? Because he was getting on a bit. I mean, for those times, he was in his 60s or late 50s, 60s. Could this guy, Jack the Texan, have helped Tumblety commit those murders? So in America, people, by the way, were pretty convinced that Tumblety was Jack the Ripper, because of what they knew about him. but as I say, he skipped bail, and there was never an attempt to extradite him back to London, curiously. And I think that was his networks of protection that he built up over decades. He managed to protect himself very effectively.
What do you think about if I don't know how much you know about this, but when 2016 there was some supposed DNA analysis of a gentleman by the name of Mr. Aaron Kaminsky.
Yes.
And supposedly him and some of his victims match up, but I was thinking about this when I was preparing to ask you about it, and I was like,
yeah,
what are the chances that that's even true? Because I mean, it's almost 140 years ago now.
Yeah,
everything could have been easily contaminated. They didn't have rubber gloves, but they didn't have plastic bags to handle their evidence in. Exactly. Not to mention, when I looked in further, he died in an insane asylum, coincidentally for killing his own sister with a knife. So like, exactly. I don't see how people can believe that one.
And it relates to a shawl. I mean, the author concerned actually bought a shawl that's believed to have been owned by one of the victims, and as you say, the level of contamination of that shawl. I mean, I don't know how useful. He's obviously adamant that it stacks up, but I know that he made the claim in 2017. I think he actually repeated the claim recently over here. I personally don't find it convincing for pretty much the same reasons that you have, that you put forward. And I don't think Kaminsky fits the bill as Jack the Ripper, and neither do some of the other suspects who are often mentioned, where their modus operandi was actually completely different. I mean, one of them was a poisoner. It just doesn't fit. I mean, the reason I'm quite keen on Tumblety is that he was a frustrated doctor. He's a frustrated surgeon, and there is a kind of an anger there in the way that those murders are committed, but the kind of pseudo surgery that's committed on those women. And I do speculate about this in the book that he is somebody who's never been taken seriously as a doctor. I mean, he fraudulently, by the way, gets a job as a surgeon in the Union Army during the Civil War until General McClellan himself boots Tumblety out when he finds out that he is not a real surgeon. So I think he's always been frustrated about not being taken seriously. And he's also a misogynist. He's got this collection of uteruses. I think, it's circumstantial. I haven't got a DNA proof for Tumblety, but I think there's some very good pointers that point to Tumblety as a more credible suspect.
The Jack the Ripper victims supposedly were all set up in almost a tableau. They were positioned. They were almost in a birthing position.
Yeah.
Is the significance of that? Would that lead more into your theory of Tumblety, given his apparent hatred of women and his homosexuality?
Yeah. I mean, there is something kind of ritualistic about. I mean, one of the victims, the Ripper's interrupted, and he then goes off and murders another woman. Actually, the only woman who's murdered outside of the East End. She's murdered in the financial districts in the City of London.
That was the same night, right?
It's the same night, and it's almost like he's been interrupted. He's frustrated. He's like, I've got to finish this ritual, And so, there is something almost kind of ritualistic. He has to go through, and it's interesting. My mother was a psychiatrist in an asylum. One of the old, psychiatric hospitals has now been shut down. That feature in horror movies these days. But she often said, that very mad, violent people, they would have to go through these kind of rituals, and if they were interrupted or they couldn't do it, they have to go and do it again. They have to start from the beginning and start again. And we see that with the Ripper.
Almost a compulsion.
It's a compulsion. And the other thing that I think...
Yeah, I was going to say, it sounds like OCD to an extent.
Exactly. And the other thing as well, I would say with Tumblety, that wasn't picked up, I think, by a lot of Ripperologists have been, these are experts on the Jack the Ripper thing, by the way. They call themselves Ripperologists. They've been,
which I learned that term studying for this, and I absolutely love it. It's one of the coolest terms I've ever heard for a specific topic, for people.
Oh, they're very serious about calling themselves Red Ripper, but they've always avoided looking at why did Tumblety go to Hot Springs, Arkansas, and you can look this up yourselves very often. Hot Springs, Arkansas was the syphilis, medication center in the States. If you had syphilis, you went to Hot Springs. It was a byword for syphilis treatment, and I think by the time Tumblety's in London, he's got. I mean, remember, it's incurable. Basically, he's got syphilis, and we know that his demeanor. People comment at the time it becomes darker. He's no longer dressing up in his, his plumed helmet and all that. He's becoming a much darker figure, and I do wonder with his hatred of women. He claims that the only woman he married turned out to be a prostitute. And he says that he found out she's a prostitute and got rid of her, and he swore off women forever. So hates prostitutes, hates women. His mind is probably going with the syphilis.
That would be a good reason for why he was strictly killing prostitutes and alcoholics.
For blaming them for giving him, or blaming fallen people. I mean, he'd have got it off a young man. But yeah, he may have got it off a woman, but highly likely it's more like a young man. But yeah, he's blaming these fallen people, these diseased people, and he's doing it in this ritualistic, pseudo-medical way, which kind of like, and we know that Tumblety is an angry person. He writes, by the way, his own biography. It's a slim volume, and he reissues it every so often, and it's full of kind of like, he's fulminating at whoever he happens to hate at that time. So it's obviously Stanton, and Lincoln's administration back in the Civil War, and then of course later on he's kind of saying, oh, the London police are meatheads and they're useless and blah 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 blah, etc. Because they're coming after.
They stealing evidence and like taking it almost like souvenirs.
Well, if there's a very early case go right back to the 1850s. He's accused of manslaughter when he's actually working in Canada, because when he's in North America, he hops across the border a lot between what's then British North America and the United States. So he works in Montreal, then he's in Detroit, then he's back in Toronto, then he's back across and the reason he's doing it is because he's getting into trouble. And something that happens in St. John, New Brunswick, is he's accused of manslaughter of one of his patients, a guy called James Portmore. And the case is going to court, and he never turns up. And then they go and look at the body of James Portmore, and his organs are missing. and Tumblety has just blatantly, first of all, he's stolen this guy's organs because it's obviously evidence of his crappy poisonous medicine he's given him. And then he flees across, and it's written about in a jokey style, by the way, by the newspapers at the time. And you can go and look it up if you have a newspaper archive. Tumblety rides on a white steed through the night and is seen on his way to Maine with these organs in his bag. So he's got form, and this is form going back decades. And he's implicated, by the way, in another manslaughter in Liverpool in England, which he narrowly avoids conviction for, and he's accused of poisoning that person, with his Duff medicines.
The amount of, even if it's circumstantial evidence that you're putting out, I firmly believe that you might be on the right path here for who is Jack the Ripper.
It's like he wasn't even hiding some of this shit. Like, I don't know if it was
blatant.
A desire to be braggadocious or stupidity or what, but like.
Well, what you guys are saying is exactly what newspapers at the time said. They said, is he doing this for publicity? I mean, this is what American newspapers said at the time. Is he either innocent, but he's putting himself in the center of these crimes in order to kind of promote his business, but he's playing a risky game, or is he actually that person? Of course, we know in our own time that celebrities are more than capable of operating in plain sight. And I think if you're a kind of psycho celebrity, a psychotic celebrity, you kind of enjoy it. You're almost daring the authorities to bring it on. And certainly with Tumblety, if you read, I've obviously detailed it in the book, but time and again, it's like he doesn't shrink back, and then he attacks the police, and he's kind of playing this constant game, daring them to come and get him. And I think what's fascinating at the end in New York, he steps off the ship in New York. He immediately assaults some guy who he tries to make an advance at in the streets. Then there's this murder of this woman. But what I find interesting is that when he ends up in court, high-profile people come to court to get him off. So the New York district attorney gets him off this assault case. Why? Why would he get involved? Why would the New York DA go
Was he
into
the Jeffrey
court?
Epstein of his time?
Well, to defend a man who's just been accused of being Jack the Ripper in London, why would a politician risk that? You know, so it's there's something going on. He plays his Irish networks. There's no doubt about that. I think he plays, you know, what a gay networks basically. I think he has other networks too, he pays. He's clearly, because his fortunes go up and down. He's always, by the way, when he's arrested, he's always found to have huge amounts of diamonds and money on his person. And when he dies, he's got a lot of diamonds and money on his person. And he's bribing people, I think. And one thing I should add about when he dies in 1903, he's got all this money on him, vast amount of money in the bank, which his family, by the way, fight over for years. But he also has a couple of very cheap rings. And one theory, and it's not my theory, this is the theory that's been put out by other people, is that those two rings were from Annie Chapman, one of the Jack the Ripper's victims. Because it's incongruous why he has because he loves ostentation. He loves beautiful, expensive things. He knows his jewelry, but he's got these two cheap rings. And the Metropolitan Police for a long time were trying to find her wedding ring and what's called a keeper ring that were taken off. And they went around pawnbrokers around London trying to find it. So a lot of people think that he kept those as mementos, and that's what was on his body when he died in St. Louis in a hospital in 1903.
It's just wild that people are protecting a syphilitic psychopath. Just, I mean, syphilis causes insanity. We know.
Yeah.
This deteriorates the brain. It eats your brain. It's amazing to me that he had enough sway and enough power to still protect himself, even though he was quite literally falling apart.
Completely. And I think, I mean, there were strange times. There's no doubt about it. I mean, I write about in the book about there were other fraudsters and hucksters, you know, at the time in the Civil War period. There was one guy who was a leading military officer in the Union forces whose military record was entirely made up. He was a circus trainer. He claimed to be a duke or baron from Hungary, and he set up a Hungarian regiment, and it was funded, and Washington society loved him. Then he was exposed. He was eventually sent to Sing Sing. And I think there was something about mid-century America. They loved and they hated hucksters, you know, these kind of these con men. And Tumblety fits into this perfectly. It's this time of showmanship, you know. It's, as I say, it's that kind of P.T. Barnum ethos, and it's a kind of like unregulated capitalism of the time. You know, there's no regulations, no holds barred. Do what you want, say what you want, be what you want. In some ways, I do argue in the book, have we gone back to that? You know, on social media, you know, people can be anything they want to be. I think Tumblety would have loved social media. He'd have turned himself into any number of things. But my argument is that, you know, he was a proto celebrity, but he was also Jack the Ripper.
It's crazy between the Knights Templar and Jack the Ripper. As you're talking, you know, in my head, I'm start forming so many similarities between things in the news today with celebrities and people get caught with stuff. One more question before we go into our final question here. And please, again, we're here to learn, so call bullshit on us if you think. No. If it wasn't Tumblety and it wasn't a surgeon, I learned that back then the barber pole with the white and the red and the blue, it often meant that, you know, they were capable of doing other things. Yeah. Like some barbers actually could perform surgeries, cutting out tumors and stuff like that.
Yep.
Could they have the type of precision, or maybe a butcher have the type of precision that was needed to do the things that they did and leave these women in the way that they were?
So they did look at a butcher as a suspect, and butchers, you know, were suspects. Barbers, but yes, you're right about barbers, but the barber surgeon, the surgeons, you know, if you were around in the Middle Ages, if you're around in early modern society, you would go to the barber to have minor surgery, because major surgery, you had it done in front of 100 people in what claimed to be a proper surgical environment. But of course, the story of Sweeney Todd, you know, and the barber whose sister, who's a serial killer barber, turning his clients into pies. So, barbers undoubtedly would have had the wherewithal and and handy with a blade, basically. So, yeah, why not? Didn't give them a cut and shave at the same time, but yeah.
I read something really cool that I wanted to point out because I don't know if Steve knows this. I'm trying to remember what it was. Like he was supposedly right-handed, so that when he slit their throats, the blood squirted to the opposite side as not to get on him.
Right. I didn't know that. I didn't know that. Yeah.
That was one of the things I wasn't aware of that one. It was one of those little things that stuck in my mind where I was all like, who would have thought of that? As to be like, oh, I'm going to slit their throat and I'm right-handed. I'm going to stand on this side of them because the blood's going to squirt that way,
Yeah.
So.
I mean, I'm always amazed by the fact that, there's especially one of his victims, Mary Kelly, at the end, that, he completely eviscerates this woman. I mean, in the most horrific way. And yet, the London of the time, it was the sort of place where a scream in the night was just, oh, well, that's just another scream in the night. People didn't necessarily rush to your aid or assume, something terrible was happening, because this was it was a city that was pretty lawless, and a lot of poverty. That part as well, the East End, a lot of poverty, a lot of people living on top of each other, huge amount of crime, and a very ineffective police force. And I think it's just incredible that he, in the darkness of those streets as well, with the fog and everything, the industrial pollution that, sometimes couldn't see a hand in front of your face, that he moved silently, conducting those murders, and got away with it. Never found.
When you say he eviscerated her, was his last victim sloppy?
His last victim was, I think, what people, and it was a really crazed attack, a really, and it's where he almost, it's almost demented.
Well, that would support the syphilis theory as he gets older and time goes on. Descending into madness or losing his mind. Yeah,
no, for sure. And the kind of anger and frustration. I mean, something's building up, because that last victim is really is a kind of it's. I mean, even by today's standards, I think we'd be horrified by what happened to poor Mary Kelly.
Well, Mr. McMahon, again, we could keep you here all night, but we don't want to do that. But before we get on to our questionnaire to wrap this up, why don't you tell people where they can find not only your books, but maybe you on social media as well?
Yeah. Well, so these two gems are on Barnes and Noble. And,
I love the cover on the Jack the Ripper one.
Do you like the cover? I like the cover on the
It's just what I picture when I think Jack the Ripper.
It's what it's like out here on our London streets, I fear to go out there now. You probably heard the police sirens going by occasionally, a lot of crime around here. But yeah, you can buy them on Amazon, obviously. Barnes and Noble. There's a load of online stores. If you tap in the Knights Templar, Tony McMahon, History and Mystery, it's called the Knights Templar History and Mystery, you'll find it. Jack the Ripper and Abraham Lincoln, Tony McMahon, again, you'll find them in the same places, but Amazon is probably your easiest bet. But if there's a bookstore that's got them, of course we must support our bookstores. I'm honor bound to say that. And in terms of if you just put Tony McMahon History or Tony McMahon History Bear, I'll turn up. I've got a website called the Templar Knights, which I've been running now for 15 years, a blog site, which has masses of stuff on the Templars. TheTemplarKnight.com, if you want to know anything about the Templars,
which we will put in the description of this episode for you.
That's very sporting of you. And then I've got a kind of a general history one where I play around with stuff, all sorts of history, called beardyhistory.com.
So I'm a fan of beardy history.
And the YouTube side's called History Bear, because I'm a bear. And I do this.
Well, Mr. McMahon, I don't know if you know who these gentlemen are, but there's a gentleman by the name of Mr. Bernard Pivot who invented this questionnaire and was perfected by James Lipton on Inside the Actor Studio. And if you can't figure a way how to end your podcast on your own, then I say, hell, steal from someone who's already done it better.
Definitely.
So,
cheers.
All great artists and thieves, aren't they?
By the way, real quick before we go into it, I gotta ask, what's on the cup that you're drinking from?
Oh, this it's a Star Wars.
That's what I thought it was. I thought I saw a stormtrooper on there.
There you go.
You just got 10,000 cool points,
right? But Mr. McMahon, what is your favorite word?
My favorite
word.
Oh, my favorite word. Ooh, that's a good one. God, I'm going to say history.
What is your least favorite word?
Mathematics.
What sound or noise do you love?
The sea. Love beaches.
What sound or noise do you hate?
Police sirens going by my bloody window all the time. Yeah, police sirens. Yeah.
Your sirens sound cooler than ours, though.
So. But it never stops. We've got so much crime here.
What profession, other than your own, would you like to attempt?
When I was a kid, I always wanted to be an archaeologist. I still think I'd like to be an archaeologist, but it has to be somewhere glamorous. You know, it has to be Egypt or something like that.
I mean, in a way, you kind of are an archaeologist. You're digging up the past and figuring things out. So you kind of made it in your own way. What profession other than your own would you not like to attempt?
Lawyers.
Oh, nobody likes lawyers. Lawyers and bankers, they can all go jump off a cliff.
What did somebody once said? Sharks never attack lawyers out of professional
courtesy.
Yeah, special courtesy.
Creatively, what turns you on?
Oh, you know, it's funny. I am a big fan of I suppose what you call sacred art. I never go to church as a Catholic. I'm terrible, right? But I love his old churches. I can't, if I see an old church, I have to go in. You know, so kind of sacred art is my weakness.
In the same vein, creatively, what turns you off?
R&B.
I've never heard that one. That's an original.
That's the first.
My favorite question of the whole thing. What's your favorite curse word?
Oh, am I allowed to say it?
Yeah, absolutely. You can say whatever you want here.
No, I'm going to say I won't say that one. I'll say bollocks because it's a good British. Bollocks is a good British.
You would not believe how many American guests of ours say cunt, but they want to be able to say it with an English accent.
I know. I was going to say cunt because it's. Do you know that we had a?
It just sounds fantastic coming out of that accent.
Yeah, it sounds less painful coming from your mouth, or less hurtful.
Yeah,
everyone loves that one.
Our final question: if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
I forgive you.
I'm gonna remember.